Now the question of tradition, which tradition to follow, is of course an artistic choice. So would you not consider this as a subjective choice, the choice of the artist, which tradition I should follow? Even the mind of Europe is an artistic mind created by the beings of Europe, the poets of Europe. So the choice of this kind of tradition is also related to the objectivity vis-a-vis subjectivity of the poet. Means the poet has to make a subjective choice and then work objectively in order to materialize the choice of the form. So in the selection of form, we have metaphysical poets like John Donne, Marvell, or even the Victorian poet like Robert Browning, where we have the conscious selection of the form and interrelationship between the form and the content in a very intellectual manner, so as to make a unified sensibility of intellect with emotion, thought with feeling. Therefore, was a thought to done was a kind of challenge to him. So it kept on modifying his sensibility. It kept on modifying his sensibility. He kept on improvising on this particular thought. So the separation of the lovers, just think of that. John Donne is describing the separation of the lover in the poem A Valediction Forbidding Mourning. So our love, as stiff twin compasses are two, thy foot the fixed foot makes no show, but doth move when the other do. So the separation of the lover is defined with the help of a compass. And here T.S. Eliot finds the use of metaphysical conceit in a proper way that unifies the sensibility of the poet. So the poet is emotionally surcharged. The poet thinks that the separation of the lovers at this point of juncture and the words of valediction forbidding mourning must be equally compensated by an objective representation of that in a work of art. Therefore, he is using a conceit, a far-fetched simile yoked by violence together in order to represent that particular thought. So the thought is presented in such a way that the sensibility generated through the poem is quite objective and has the capability of attaining the universal. So this is a plain use of symbology, a trope in order to represent. So my love is like a red, red rose. A poet might say, spontaneously responding to that. And T.S. Eliot will say that, no, this is a spontaneous overflow of powerful emotion. This representation of rose must be looked at in a different way, objectively. And there should not be any kind of spontaneous overflow, outburst of emotion. He said that even the adolescent art of the small children who are emotionally surcharged, writing poetry. In Seven Ages of Man, you remember that a lover writing ballads to the mistress's brow, that is spontaneous. For T.S. Eliot, no, this is not right poetry, because this only is a kind of overflow of emotion without the premediation of art. Artistic truth is something very objective, according to T.S. Eliot. When you are trying to modify that into a work of art, that emotion has to be regulated, controlled, has to be separated, and there should be a kind of escape. So poetry is not an expression of emotion. T.S. Eliot is writing in Tradition and Individual Talent. Poetry is not an expression of human emotion, rather an escape from it. So poetry is produced not with the emotional exuberance of the poet, but rather a conscious, objective escape of the poet from that emotional state, emotional exuberance. And he will be talking about this in the essay Metaphysical Poets, where John Donne and Marvell, they are regarded as the models of unified sensibility. In the works of Robert Browning, again, he found that there is a possibility of unified sensibility because of the dramatic nature. So when we read a poem like Porphyria's Lover, where we have the plight of this lover jilted by love, and the beloved comes to meet this lover, leaving her wedding occasion, and the final killing of the beloved takes place. We do not have any kind of trace of the poet Robert Browning in this poem. And for T.S. Eliot, this is a kind of dramatic representation of the truth. So in case of Hamlet, T.S. Eliot found the dramatic representation is artistically failed, and it appears to be a Mona Lisa of literature because of the different levels of ambiguity and the non-representation in an objective and dramatic manner, the form of reality. So we hear a lot from Hamlet about Hamlet, and other characters are mummed, are not given that particular voice. In the poems of Robert Browning, again, T.S. Eliot found the unified sensibility where thought is blended with emotion, intellect is blended with feeling, and this is done through unified sensibility. Objective correlative is therefore related with T.S. Eliot's theory of poetry. The only way of expressing emotion in the form of art, what is the only way? So one viewpoint that this only monopolistic way of expressing emotion in form of art. T.S. Eliot has often been accused of this modernist tendency to monopolize the definition and theory of art. So we can safely say that T.S. Eliot's theory of poetry is also monopolistic. And what he says, like Aristotle, instead of simply defining poetry, he's also trying to establish a tradition of poetry, stating that the only way of expressing emotion in form of art is to represent things in an objective manner. So in the world of plurality, where we have the possibility of different forms of poetry, of different types of poetry, even the subjectivity of the poet, especially in the personal poems like sonnet, ode, lyric, all these are possible. How can we simply say that the only way of expressing emotion in form of art is based on objective correlative? Nevertheless, what T.S. Eliot said is that in order to achieve this objective correlative, a set of objects, a situation, a change of events, which shall be the formula of that particular emotion. See the scientific precision with which T.S. Eliot is trying to formulate the theory of poetry. Almost Aristotelian. So Aristotle in his Poetics is trying to define tragedy as a combination of 6 elements: plot, character, thought, diction, melody, spectacle. So if you combine these 6 elements, you will get poetry, either dramatic or narrative. Especially in dramatic poetry, we have to have this combination of 6 elements. And in chapter 6, it simply defines that tragedy is an imitation of an action that is serious, thereby making a definition of poetry, a theory of poetry based on empirical understanding, definitely, of the existing works of art, but also trying to prescribe for the future artist a form of theory. Now, this theory that has the possibility of challenge cannot become a law. Okay, the theory that is challenged cannot become a law. And critical theory can also have the possibility of alternative readings, alternative views. So T.S. Eliot's tendency of making his theoretical position as laws of poetry is dangerous. So we must take that also with a pinch of salt, because T.S. Eliot, remember, was also a poet who is trying to generalize, materialize, and justify the form of poetry that he is writing. So he is saying that the only way of expressing emotion in form of art is objective correlative. And by objective correlative, he means a set of objects, a situation, a chain of events, which shall be the formula for that particular emotion. Formula, I am using the word formula again with emphasis to state that a poet, we have all taken it for granted, as William Shakespeare has stated, the poet, the lunatic, and the lover are of the same constitution made, at least does not follow a formula. So there is no formula for poetry as such. But here T.S. Eliot is prescribing a formula as if he is a chemist, a scientist who is prescribing a formula. His regular use of the scientific tropes to define poetry is again a kind of formulation of poetic theory into a structure representation, into an artistic form of representation. Now, if someone wants to break the form, what will happen? If someone wants to change the form, what will happen? If someone wants to say that I will write a sonnet, but I will not have 14 lines, I will have, say, 20 lines. In a line, I will not have 10 syllables, I will have 12 syllables or 14 syllables. Will the sonnet be written? So the question is related to the form and the content. So this form and the content relationship has also the difficulty of understanding, the difficulty of recognizing what type of structure has to be used for which form of poetry. This is an objective choice, a selection to be made by the poet. But this selection has to be subjective. The poet has to select the one form that is more capable of expressing the particular form of emotion. Say, for example, in preludes, the form of poetry that T.S. Eliot is using in case of preludes, short lyrical composition, urban in milieu, okay, almost creating a kind of objective correlative by situating the action without the presence of the poet narrator or the voice of the narrator. We can hear a consciousness that is actually regulating the entire metropolitan space and setting with strict objectivity, with strict set of objects set in a correlation and having a structure of emotion of its own. Say in the first prelude, when the poet is talking about the settling of the winter evening settles down with smell of sticks passageways. 6 o'clock, the burnt out ends of smoky days. In this series of poems, prelude, we have the central consciousness. But this central consciousness is not the human consciousness. Rather, this is the consciousness of the street. So we are hearing the voice of the street in the poem, preludes. The consciousness of the street, that is the voice. So it appears to be the voice of a narrator, but that is deceptive. Rather, we hear the voice, personified voice of the metropolitan location, geopolitical location, the space, the street, the lighting of the lamps, the sound of the street, muttering retreats. All these are captured by the poet. So who is capturing the sounds of the urban? We remember that in, say, William Blake's London, we again have the sound that are there captured by the poet in a very rhythmic manner. I wander through a chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. Then we have the sound, the cries that are heard on the street of London. So the cries of men, the infant's cry of fear, and then we have the, in every voice, in every band, mind forged manacles I do hear. So this I, personal I, is he the poet? Is he the poet person, or has the poet been able to separate himself, being present as an omniscient presence, as a third person presence across the metropolitan location? Similarly, in this poem, Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, this objective correlative is maintained by impersonating the voice of a consciousness rather than an individual. And the person who is accompanying this central consciousness of the poem is the metropolitan location, especially the street. So are these composed in a rhythmic manner? Does it capture the rhythms of the urban life, urban location, metropolitan location? So here form is content form, if we take that into account and regard this as a set of object, a situation, a chain of event, which becomes the formula of that particular emotion. In Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, we have, or we hear the song of love, a love that is, of course, metropolitan, urban, lower middle class, a love that is promoted by the desire as well as the failure. So the entire monologue is very close to a soliloquy where there is a debate between the self, between the consciousness split into two halves. Here Eliot describes that the emotion that is presented in Prufrock is never in excess, while the emotion that is presented in Shakespeare's Hamlet is in excess. Let us look at this particular poem, whether the emotion that is presented in this particular poem, Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, is in excess or not, whether it is also not able to separate the artist from the work of art, whether the voice of the artist also comes into the work of art. This is a poem that is composed very early. 1940 is the 14 is the date of composition of this poem. So these were the Harvard years when T.S. Eliot was contributing to the poetry magazine published from the Harvard University. So here we have a very young T.S. Eliot was born in 1888. So he was very young, almost just past his 20s, composing a poem, Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, that presents a person who is almost as old as Orsino of Shakespeare's play, Twelfth Night. Remember Orsino appearing on the stage? If music be the food of love, play on, give me excess of it. So here we have the same Orsino-like character, J. Alfred Prufrock, who is trying to think about the possibility of love and marriage in a modern metropolitan life. So this is a pre-First World War life, and with the publication of this poem in 1916, we have the experience of the World War years that has alienated individuals to that corner, secluded corner of the metropolitan location without the horrors of the urban life that we find in the post-First World War poetry like The Wasteland. So here we have the rhythms of the contemporary life. So if we look at this rhythm of contemporary life, we have the use of jazz rhythm in T.S. Eliot's poem. So he's talking about disinterested exercise of intelligence. Disinterested exercise of intelligence is a part of criticism, as a part of poetry criticism. And he is also using this disinterested exercise of intelligence in the writing of poetry. It is a correction of taste. In Kantian sense, this kind of disinterestedness has to be subjective. He is talking about the disinterestedness that is there, especially in judgment. A poet, while writing poem, should have a kind of disinterestedness from the object of art. That is what T.S. Eliot talks about, objective correlative. So the poet should not be interested in the work of art. There should be a disinterestedness. And this disinterestedness should also be based on some kind of universality. Interestingly, this type of universality has to be objective in T.S. Eliot's sense. That means anywhere, if you place the experiment, keeping in mind the conditions, the experimental conditions, the result, inferential results will come to be same, will become the same. Thereby, the result of the experiment will become universal. Can poetry be brought such close to the inferential, empirical way of seeing or seeking truth? So the structure of emotion that is there, a set of object, a situation, a chain of events, all these are creating a kind of formula of art in T.S. Eliot's work, will produce some kind of universals. Aristotle also defined the set of universals using his famous Aristotelian mean. So if you just combine the sum total, make a sum total of all the variables and divide the sum total of the variables with the number of variables, you get an average. And that is called Aristotelian average mean. So anything that is above the average is good, better than the average. Anything that is below the average is worse than the average. And when he's defining poetry, dramatic poetry, he's saying that tragedy is an imitation of people better than the average, while comedy is an imitation of people worse than the average. So this is also very objective way of analyzing. So the sum total of the variables divided by number of variables that can create the average is also an inferential truth that can theorize the subject matter of poetry. Now T.S. Eliot is working on the particular. So particular, say the consciousness of a particular man, J. Alfred Prufrock. But this particular has to be turned into something universal by making a sum total of all the Prufrocks of the world, thinking of marrying, thinking of proposing a girl, together with all the Prufrocks divided by number of Prufrocks in the world. So you get a sum total of that. So a structure, a set of emotion that is thereby created will create a chain of events which shall be the formula of that particular emotion. Now this is in case of literature very difficult to express, because literature always works on critical thinking, thinking outside the box. Even T.S. Eliot is thinking outside the box. He is not plainly imitating the works of, say, Dante or works of Baudelaire, Laforge. Rather, he's trying to create something new, trying to make the particular as typical, the typical as particular, so as to make the representation separate from the artist. That means we can say that the characters who are present in J. Alfred Prufrock do not resemble the poet. In Hamlet also we have so many characters, and T.S. Eliot found failure in artistic representation of Hamlet because in this 40,000 word play, this Hamlet speaks almost 14,000 words. Okay, almost a half. His presence is throughout the play and he speaks most. Even he talks about words, being too much obsessed with words. His soliloquies are longer than what they are supposed to be in other plays. Now, in other plays of Shakespeare, where T.S. Eliot did not find any fault, like a play like Hamlet, where we have several characters, we cannot recognize which character resembles Shakespeare. In Hamlet, T.S. Eliot says that this Hamlet represents the artistic ambiguity, ambivalence, confusion, okay, uncertainty of the poet. A poet who is in the flux of to be or not to be makes a character placed in the play who is also fluctuating, oscillating between the extremities of to be or not to be, raising that question in the play. So in case of Macbeth, this is not so. All the characters have their independent dramatic existence. Now take into account a poem, J. Alfred Prufrock. J. Alfred Prufrock is a polyphony, dramatic polyphony, where we have the voices of so many characters present in the work. And these are also the songs and rhythms that are generated from the urban milieu, the world of the metropolis. And all these voices are combined together. And we can always safely say that not a single voice is that of T.S. Eliot, the person, but all the voices are mediated by or written by T.S. Eliot, the poet. Now, how can you separate the poet from the artist? Okay, you cannot separate the poet from the artist. Now, how can you separate the artist from a man, from a person? So it is impossible. But T.S. Eliot wanted to separate the artist from the man who suffers. So the creative artist from the personal man who may be creative, who may be a sufferer, who may have happiness. So the work of art should have to be written like a thing that is separated from the artist. Emotions should not be expressed in such a way that there is no possibility of an escape from the work of art. So it is not turning loose of emotion. T.S. Eliot is writing in tradition and individual talent that poetry is not turning loose of emotion, rather an escape from it. Poetry is not diarrheal. It is not logorial. It is not just a spontaneous expression of words and images. It is not simply the expression of voices, putting forth the voices that occur in the mind of the poet. Rather, there should be a conscious meditation. But think of Wordsworth's definition. Wordsworth is also trying to reconcile two viewpoints. One is spontaneity, the other is conscious meditation. Think of the second part of the definition that William Wordsworth is giving. T.S. Eliot, on the other hand, is consciously ignoring the second part of the definition of Wordsworth, where Wordsworth reconciles spontaneity of poetic creation with conscious meditation. Just recall the definition. Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling that takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. That means, in short, that a poet is in a state of tranquility, trying to remember, recollect, assimilate, associate, form, engage in a mnemonic activity, memorizing activity, and then after long contemplation, the mind of the poet is filled with emotions. And once the mind is totally filled with emotion, there will be an overflow of that emotion that will produce poetry. So Wordsworth thought that that will be a good poetry because it has gone through a long process of meditation. According to Samuel Taylor Coleridge in Biographia Literaria, he also talks about the difference between the primary imagination and the secondary imagination. In the definition of the secondary imagination, Coleridge is also talking about this conscious meditation, prolonged meditation that will help, that will allow the things that are conceived by a person with the help of primary imagination, the ability of the mind to recognize infinite I am. The mind is capable of recognizing everything in the world. That mind's capability of understanding the tree as a tree, the bird as a bird, a human being as a human being is a part of primary imagination. But the poet, through a long, prolonged meditation, thinking, will try to formulate that into a structure of emotion by diffusing, dissolving, dissipating, and recreating something new. Therefore, a supernatural thing might be naturalized, or a natural thing might be supernaturalized. And Coleridge himself is asking the readers to suspend a sense of disbelief for a moment, suspend any kind of sense of disbelief for a moment, and to accept that is being presented and to trace a semblance of truth. And by tracing this semblance of truth, one can understand the meaning of poetry. Actually, Coleridge is talking about the objective transference of emotion in symbolic terms in the art of poetry. Say, for example, the image of the sun that is there in Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Nor dim, nor red, like God's own head, the glorious sun upraised. Who is responding to this evocative symbology of the sun in wrath and fury, angry like Jehovah, God of wrath and fury, so red hot in this time? When water everywhere, all the boards did shrink because of the heat of the sun. Water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. So the mariners are thirsty. Ancient Mariner has killed the albatross. And at this time, the rising of the sun is described in such a way. Coleridge is nowhere in the poem. It is through the mind of the Ancient Mariner do we see the sun. Objectivity is there. A structure of emotion is there. Set of objects that are set to produce that particular emotion that is there. But T.S. Eliot is totally ignoring the definition of these romantic poets and trying to say that my definition is the only definition that will always talk about the unification of sensibility and representation of things in a very scientific, objective, precise manner. T.S. Eliot is perhaps talking about symbology, perhaps talking about transference of the emotion through artistic symbols. And there are, of course, so many symbols in his poems. So his theory of poetry is close to the concept of objectivity in art, and he will be trying to replace that old form of poetry, that especially the Romantic school of poetry or the Elizabethan school of poetry, that gives more prominence to the communication of emotion through the persona of the poet. He is confusing with the poet persona. Therefore, in the poems of Browning, he will be seeing a kind of dramatic representation where the narrator and the poet, or the persona and the poet, they are distinct, different, dramatically represented. In case of G. Alfred Prufrock, again I come to the text, we have this unified sensibility, definitely, between intellect and thought, and we have moronization, monadification of the persona, who is presented as a typical character in a typical situation, highly individualized, replaced by a universal consciousness. I repeat, so highly individualized character, but a character who is presented as a character drawn from typical situation, placed in a typical situation, drawn from the typical life, placed in a typical metropolitan situation, a set of object, a set of structure, and in that structure, we have the presence of this character deliberating on or delivering the voices that that character is hearing. So it is not the individual character, rather the consciousness that is at the center of Eliot's poem, Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. This is also true to the work Preludes, where we have the consciousness, collective consciousness of the urban location, the metropolitan location, that will become the narrator, because it is panoptic. The eye of this narrator can see everything that is happening in the street. This is a Harvard poem. Okay, the city of Harvard, New York, London, Paris all come together in preludes. And it is the panoptic view, the eye, panoramic eyes of the narrator that can visualize the street. This is an omniscient, omnipresent, capable of seeing everything objectively, third person, capable of seeing whatever is happening in this urban location and representing that by capturing the images and voices. So these images and voices, these are all brought together in a very objective manner through the help of poetic metaphors. The vocabulary of ordinary conversation that is used, but of course this vocabulary, common day-to-day talk, polite, meaningless nods, and the commonsensical, nonsensical, everyday talk, even the fatigue communication, all these are brought together in the poetic form, and then they are versified. So from the ordinary conversation language, we have the versification of the language. And by introducing the metaphors of poetry, we have the use of poetic language in poems like J. Alfred Prufrock, The Wasteland, Preludes, Gerontian, Holloman. T.S. Eliot's objectivity depends on a conscious analysis of the fundamental basis of social reality and presenting that with the help of imagery and symbolism. So it is the language of poetry on which T.S. Eliot is working more, and this language of communication that poetry has to capture the rhythms of life. As the contemporary rhythm in T.S. Eliot's poem is of course the metropolitan and the cosmopolitan jazz rhythm. He's trying to use this in his poems. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon our table. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one night cheap hotel. So entire language appears to be more prosaic or poetic. What do you think? What type of language is this? Is the language prosaic or poetic? What type of language is this? So we have a kind of language that is used by poet consciously, and we have in the essay, Tradition and Individual Talent, the definition of a poet. Who a poet is, what is the task of a poet, and how the poet should represent the things in a very impersonal manner. Impersonality in art depends on the separation of the artist from the work of art. But the separation of the artist is intellectual. It is not the physical separation. And that has to be programmed with the use of meter in poetry, with the use of a kind of poetic sensibility represented through the rhythms of life. So he will be talking about the essential thing that has to be depersonalized. In Tradition and Individual Talent, he writes that process of depersonalization and its relation to the sense of tradition. So this depersonalization that art may be said to approach the condition of science. T.S. Eliot's theory of poetry tries to bring arts very close to science. So in Tradition and Individual Talent, he says that he will be trying to bring this process of depersonalization very close to the condition of science. So depersonalization, that art may be said to approach the condition of science. Even while talking about honest criticism, he says that it should be directed not upon the poet, but upon poetry. Honest criticism and sensitive appreciation should be directed not upon the poet, but upon poetry. This also defines what poetry is, because poetry is not poet. There is a separation between poetry and poet. And if you try to analyze the poem, you should focus on poem. This comes very close to I.A. Richards' practical criticism. So formalism in England and new criticism in America, they talk about the text. Everything is in the text. So if you have to analyze text, you should not go for a bioliterary criticism. And honest criticism, according to T.S. Eliot, is not to appreciate the poet, but to appreciate poetry. I. Richards also did this. He said that if you do not talk about the poet and if you focus only on the poem, you can find certain things that are universal. So if you diagnose a poem, anatomize a poem objectively, you will find the traits in the poem that can be objectively achieved. He talked about sense, feeling, tone, and intention. If you can identify these four things in case of poem, not by understanding who the poet is or analyzing the biography of the poet, just by looking at the text, if you try to analyze the sense, the feeling, the tone, and intention, four kinds of meanings can be derived from the text. According to T.S. Eliot also, poetry should be written in such a way that the poet is separated from the text and the text can generate its own sense, feeling, tone, and intention. So in most of the poems of T.S. Eliot, the tone and intention both are derived from the ironic viewpoint, the use of irony. And as far as the content is concerned, we have the sense and feeling generated by an objective separation of the artist from the poetic work. So no one will say that this is T.S. Eliot, who can be recognized as J. Alfred Prufrock, or this is T.S. Eliot, who can be seen through the voices of the characters who are present. You can hear so many voices in the poem, J. Alfred Prufrock. Polyphonic, multiple voices are there. These voices, as Mikhail Bakhtin has stated, are never saturated in a work of art. These voices have centripetal and centrifugal forces, and these voices are dialogic, dialogue-like. Okay, and therefore we have diglossia, heteroglossia from a work of art. Multiple meanings come out from the work of art when the work of art is objectively presented. T.S. Eliot perhaps was anticipating this view of art in his famous view of objective correlative, where he is talking about the independence of the art from the artist, capable of having dynamism of its own, capable of producing structure of emotion that can appeal to the senses of characters, senses of the readers, and have the various forms of glosses or shines. Multiple meanings can be generated through the objectification of sense, feeling, tone, and intention. Thought and language both are interrelated. So we cannot separate thought from language, language from thought. So this is very simple. Bakhtin said that we cannot separate language from thought, thought from language. Now if you think of Eliot's concept of unified sensibility, you see that yes, art is language. Art is not possible without language. Art is thought, because art is never possible without thought. Now what Eliot is saying is that the thought should be intellectual, thought should not be organic, personal. Rather, the thought should be mediated properly in order to produce something different. So to generate some kind of poetic trope, one has to intellectually work and relate that with the help of language. In linguistics, we have the use of schemes and tropes, schematized patterning of language, and the tropes that have contentual representation, the content-based representation, while the schemes represent the structure in the linguistic form, the tropes represent the meaning in the semantic form. The combination of the scheme and trope in Eliot should be very objective, and the poet should be a conscious artist, like a craftsman. If you look at a table, do you recognize the craftsman, or look at the table, analyze the table? So we analyze the table rather than the craftsman. If we look at a bubble, we look at the bubble. So in the age of mechanical reproduction, where everything looks like the other, there is no aura. The artistic aura depends on the unique nature of the work of art. And this unique nature of the work of art definitely has some subjective outpouring. T.S. Eliot is talking about that subjectivity to remain on the intellectual plane, not on the emotional plane. So it is very difficult to materialize this, while it is very easy to theorize this. Therefore, Aristotle's theory of poetry or Eliot's theory of poetry cannot turn into a law of poetry. We cannot say that this is the law of poetry as Newton's law of motion is. Okay, so we have the theory of poetry that is partly open-ended, that has some kind of opening for debates. Debates will definitely generate, but the intention of T.S. Eliot is very clear. So he wanted to work on a kind of poetry where there will be a conceptual separation between the artist and the work of art.